And I will hit record now for those who aren't here so that I can post this later since we're starting out talking about the quiz. So with quizzes, I will always send a list out to you all with plenty of time in advance so that you can review these particular content areas and just rest assured that those are going to be the things that are covered. So if you're able to focus on those, it's going to give you a really good opportunity to do well on the quiz. With our quizzes, some people might struggle with a question or two. Even as you do study, quizzes can be challenging because you just don't know what to expect, and then you only get one opportunity to take it. So please just hold in your mind the fact that quizzes are only a small part of our grade. So even if you do get a couple points off on the quiz for a question that you're not sure about, we still have many opportunities to make up missed points with discussions, with all of the other assignments that we'll be doing in the class. So while quizzes are important, they're only one way to show your learning. And some people really enjoy taking tests and quizzes and assessments, and other people find it to be stressful or frustrating. So if you are not a fan of quizzes, just be aware that they're only a small part of what we do here, okay? So with that said, I'm going to actually hop onto a PowerPoint presentation unless anybody else has any questions or comments before we get started. Okay, so can everybody see this slide? We have a yellow question mark here.
Yes.
Awesome, thanks. So I'm going to try and make this just a little bigger. There we go. So to get started, what we'll be doing in these video classes, last time we met, it was kind of just a little introduction, but we're now going to get into more of some of the meat of our course content. So when I hop onto our course page here in Blackboard, and hopefully you're all feeling more comfortable navigating Blackboard, I'm going to go into our class. And you know, right now we're working through week 3. So some of the main points for discussion have been covered in weeks 1 and 2 as well. And we've looked at these previously. But I think one of the most important things for us to discuss today is this first one here, the roots, the contemporary issues, and the subfields of psychology. So particularly right now, we'll hit on the subfields. I'm going to reshare the screen so that we can go back to this PowerPoint, because there are so many areas in the field of psychology. That's one thing that makes it really exciting. Psychology, we have a definition here provided from the text. Psychology is the science that studies behavior and mental processes. So there are some areas in the field of psychology where behavior is the main focus, and we're not really looking a lot at what goes on in the mind itself. And then with the mental process component, there are some areas of psychology that don't look much at behavior and instead are all about analyzing the past and people's experiences and preferences and goals, and that would be more of the mental process side. So there are many different areas of psychology and many different opportunities for application, which in my opinion makes it a very interesting topic to study. So the final part of this definition states, psychology seeks to apply that study in the service of human welfare. I love that definition because it reminds us that psychology is a helping field. It's a helping area of study, and it is a helping profession. And for people who are studying or working or researching in the field of psychology, it's a really beautiful way to fulfill a calling to help others and to support people who are struggling or who want more from their lives. But it's also quite valuable for us as we study and learn and practice psychology, and perhaps even if you pursue work in the field one day, to remember that Jesus Christ is our Savior, and He is the only hope for salvation for any person in the world. This is a fine line. You all interested in healthcare professions, or you all interested in psychology professions, and myself working in a helping field, I've had to continually remind myself and work with God on this and learn over the years that I cannot save anybody. So I just want to speak to that. Because in the field of psychology, you do encounter a lot of people who are struggling with a lot of really hard things. And when we approach that from the biblical perspective, integrating best practices and foundations of knowledge in the field of psychology with the hope and grace and salvation that is provided to us through our Lord Jesus Christ, we can find the authentic well-being and the peace that passes all understanding that we are looking for. Much more than can be provided by any secular therapeutic approach. But when I say that, please know I'm not knocking therapy either. Therapy and counseling can be very beneficial for many people. And particularly in a Christian counseling setting, we can really integrate scripture and the biblical perspective, and that's powerful on a whole different level. So the service of human welfare, that's just a note on helping professions and just checking ourselves in the importance of surrendering clients or patients or students or whoever you may be working with in the future, surrendering those people who are vulnerable and hurting and struggling to God, just as we cast all our own cares upon Him and surrender ourselves to Him each day. That's the only way to sustain wellness as you work and study in the field. And it's the only way to thrive and to continue and to avoid burnout and compassion fatigue and some of those really harmful areas and dynamics that can occur for people. So a couple of areas of psychology that are listed here. We talked in the objectives about the subfields. And you all have been reading and studying this already, but I just want to hit on them while we're here together. So positive psychology, it's definitely what it sounds like. There is a course at Colorado Christian University in the College of Adult and Graduate Studies called Transformational Psychology. And that's a really powerful course area as well. It does focus on positive psychology, but with the biblical perspective in mind. And so it gives it that whole new twist of hope and salvation and wholeness within Christ and within our relationship with God. And positive psychology in the secular field does focus on happiness and strengths. So instead of starting at a deficit, for instance, and trying to figure out how to fix a problem, the approach in positive psychology is more about how to generate growth and to get to somewhere better, perhaps from somewhere that's already pretty good. And that can be a popular approach in some fields. Some people don't prefer or enjoy positive psychology, and they more have interest in the therapeutic aspect and in addressing a problem or a concern. And there are medical models as well. And we'll get to all that, even down there where it says biological psychology. But cognitive psychology is another popular subfield and approach. And in cognitive psychology, we're really looking at the mental processes. It does say the brain here in this definition, but it's more about the thoughts and the functioning. We're not looking at neurons and hormones and those things in cognitive psychology. Cognitive behavior therapy is something you may already be familiar with. It is a very popular approach in the field of psychology for therapeutic intervention, and that could be for a person struggling with significant anxiety. There are all sorts of areas in which CBT is incorporated. CBT focuses on the concept that thoughts drive feelings, drive actions. So our thoughts, what we choose to think about, that's our cognition, lead to our emotions. And so if I think to myself, oh, I was a failure at work today, then my emotion would be what? How would you define an emotion that could come from that thought to anybody? You can pop it in the chat too if you prefer that.
Negative or discouraging?
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. Absolutely, discouragement. And I'm pretty sure everybody on this video and everybody watching it has been there, right? With those feelings of discouragement and, why so downcast, oh my soul, put your hope in God is a verse that comes to my mind. When our thoughts are negative, they drive those feelings to develop and sometimes to overtake us and really bring us down. I'm seeing chats, anger. Ooh, good one. Thanks, Sarah. And Rain had agreed with that. Nice work, you guys. I love the chat feature too. So speak up or chat either way. But our thoughts drive our feelings, which drive our behaviors with this cognitive approach and cognitive behavior therapy. So if my thought is I was a failure at work today, and my feeling is discouragement, just as Ellen shared, perhaps my behavior will be, let me think, to lie in my bed and eat Cheetos all night and not to do anything productive. That could be my behavior. If my thought is I was a failure at work today and my emotion, as we were saying in the chat box, is anger, then my behavior might be to, punch a pillow or scream, or to let my aggression and frustration out by snapping at a loved one in conversation when it has nothing to do with them. And we all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory, right? Says the Bible. And so as I think about this, and even as I'm sharing it, I can think of times when negative thoughts and thoughts that are not uplifting have led to the emotion of anger, which then can lead to behavior that is not becoming and is not in alignment with what a follower of Christ would do. So we can see how in the therapeutic setting, thoughts drive feelings, drive behaviors can quickly be twisted to move in a positive direction. So if the thought is, I was a failure at work today, the therapist or the provider in this situation would facilitate a thought shift, would encourage the person to be very aware and mindful of his or her thoughts. And if the thought is, I was a failure at work today, how might I reframe that in a more healthy or positive manner after a bad day at work when I made mistakes? You can chat or speak up. How could I reframe that thought? Make a new statement. I see a chat. Thanks, guys. Oh, Sarah, I love it. I really appreciate your input because it's better than just listening to me talk all the time. So thank you, Sarah. So I tried my best. Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think all of us, generally do give our best. And as we're able, we are doing that good effort in the workplace or in school. And in the end, as I mentioned, nobody is perfect. We all live in a fallen world. And so we do make mistakes. We do mess up. We do work more slowly than our supervisor might have preferred, for instance. And so these hard times do come to us. And if the thought is, I tried my best, what emotion might come from that thought? Chat or verbal? Thanks. Chat. Satisfaction. Thanks, Sarah. I love it. Yes, I tried my best. Satisfaction or relief. Or some comfort. And if I feel that relief knowing I did my best, my behavior might be to continue to do my best throughout the evening, to make something for dinner, to spend time with a loved one, to clean up my home, and to continue to be productive and healthy. So for a person who's having trouble getting out of a kind of cognitive or mental rut, cognitive behavior therapy can be really effective. And thank you guys for your participation in that. Something more positive. Yes, Rain, absolutely. I agree. And so the whole concept here, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree or a little bit of both, but in cognitive behavior therapy and this cognitive approach is that by changing our thoughts, we can change our mindsets and attitudes and ultimately change our behavior. So if a person has a problem behavior, just trying to think of something off the top of my head. We were looking at anger. So if the problem behavior is physical aggression and this person is often, punching walls or kicking and losing control, raising voice, etc. This approach would say, if you change your thoughts, if you consciously reflect on your cognitive processes and your thoughts, and you change those to become more healthy and more appropriate, then in the end, your behaviors will change too. And the thoughts are the root of your problem. So please share your thoughts on that approach. And you can put them in the chat. You can put them in, you can speak up. Do you agree with this cognitive behavioral approach? Changing our thoughts can change our behavior, or do you think it's more complicated than that? So ponder for a moment and then please share.
I agree with that statement. I think there are other elements that can contribute to it, but I've seen in my own life and from people around me that when you change your thinking, it can definitely lead to a change in behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And so maybe what I'm hearing from you is that it's not that simple, but it's definitely a place to start. Is that kind of where you were going with that?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yep, absolutely. And I'm seeing in the chat another response saying, I agree with this approach. Sometimes I feel that people don't want to or feel like they can't change their thoughts, so they do not try. Yep, absolutely. Has anyone here ever had a time where they feel like their thoughts could not be altered or they were stuck in that negative space? Yes, definitely. So Sarah says yes. And I think this reflection is important too. What I want to say is in the field of psychology, one of the most fun parts of all of this is that we can find connection to our own lives. And not only to our own lives, but to the lives of other people. So up here in the chat, when Rain said, I think that people don't want to or feel like they can't change their thoughts. Rain, maybe that's something that you've observed in others, and not only in our own lives, but in the people around us, the people we love. So studying psychology can help you to better understand your friends, your family members, and your loved ones, colleagues, fellow students. We encounter a lot of interesting and unique people in our lives. And so great input on that. The biological component, this is very important. So the biological approach in psychology is a very popular one. And if you think about the difference between a psychologist or a counselor or a therapist and a psychiatrist, you're probably aware of this and have read up on it and understood it already, but the psychiatrist is coming much more from the biological perspective, because the role of a psychiatrist is to prescribe psychiatric or psychotropic medications. So medication obviously is a biological process. We are providing a pill, for instance, that can affect the levels of serotonin in the brain. So one topic we'll be looking into in this course is psychiatric medication treatment and when that might be appropriate or for whom, or what our own perspectives are on it, using that biblical worldview to filter everything that we learn. So I'm looking forward to your life experiences or perspectives that you want to share regarding all of these topics, the cognitive component, the biological component. Hormones play a major part in thought processes and emotion, as we know. Genetics can be related here and relevant, and obviously just the neurons firing in our brains, the serotonin, dopamine, all of these things that we've started to study and will continue to study are very important parts of our emotions and our psychological experiences and thought processes. So that's the biological component. The more medical approach, understanding that psychology and psychological functioning happens in the brain, and we can treat problems in that area using chemical, physiological approaches. Now, as I mentioned, you may encounter things in this course that you agree with or don't agree with, and you're welcome to share those things in a respectful way. We want to hear your perspectives. The discussion board is a great place to do that. But my hope is that the content in this course will just allow you to reflect more on all of these different topics and issues, and that in the end, the Bible is our ultimate authority as believers. So we can really take hold of that and return to the scripture as well to really find the mind of the Lord on each of these topics. Because as we know in the field of psychology, things can be secular and they can be worldly, and they can also be really productive and helpful. So it just depends on what we're looking at and that lens of scripture, as I mentioned. And then developmental psychology, one of my favorite parts of the field of psychology, looking at human development stages and phases over the lifetime. So even now, if you reflect on your childhood, your perspectives on the world and your ability to manage difficult emotions, those things were probably much different for you when you were 3 years old than when you were 12 years old in comparison to your age now. Lifespan psychology examines what happens to a person, to the psyche, to relationships, to social connections, and to just mental health and well-being in general as a person moves through a traditional lifespan. So what kind of brain development goes on for a little baby even before birth? What kind of cognitive awareness develops, object permanence, things of that nature for a young child? And how do we become more aware of concrete reasoning and abstract thinking in the world around us as we grow older? Ultimately, in adolescence, that's one of my favorite phases to study for developmental psychology, because we can talk a lot about peer influences and people trying to determine who they want to be in the world and what kinds of behaviors and lifestyle choices are going to carve that out for them. And that could be pursuing a college education. It could be getting into music or athletics, or it could be ultimately, the walk with the Lord and really taking independence in that regard. And that's a beautiful time to do that, merging into adulthood. So there are all sorts of topics in developmental psychology. The concept of surviving versus thriving comes into the transformational approach. But even thinking about older adults and people whose, if they did have children, those children may have moved on into adulthood. Those older adults are often faced with the work of Erickson, refers to it as either generativity or stagnation. And so do we want to pursue a lively and connected and involved approach, or are we just going to kind of fall into a depressive state and become isolated and struggle with physical health problems that just take us down a darker road? And so there are many different aspects of development, even into old age and coming into the topic of death and dying, that can be examined in the field. Okay, so those are some topics regarding subfields. Would love to hear anything that anyone wants to share about all of this. I know we've been starting out with the work of Freud. What do you think of the reading so far and the content? Is there anything you agree with, disagree with?
I found the biological approach to be most interesting to me so far because from classes I've taken in high school already, biology has been really interesting to me. So learning more about the brain and how that affects our lives has been really interesting.
I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you so much for sharing that. We'll definitely dive into that as we proceed, and understanding the brain helps us to understand our own behavior as well as the behavior of those around us. So good insight. I want to look at, I see a chat. Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. Sarah says it's all very interesting. I feel like I'm learning and expanding my perspectives. I'm so glad to hear that. So this is a really good place to start. Biopsychosocial is something I'll hit on before we conclude. And again, thank you for being here. You all have had really good input today, and it means a lot to hear from you. The biopsychosocial approach is something that we will be emphasizing and focusing on throughout this course. And the definition of this can be broken down really quite easily because there are three main words within this big word, right? So bio is that biological component. I see a chat. Oh, Ellen, wonderful. I'm glad to hear it. Yeah, so both Caitlin and Ellen have enjoyed that biological component, the psychological or psycho component, and the social component, obviously, are connections with others. So bottom line, you can see this beautiful little visual with the circles. The biopsychosocial approach tells us that people are not how they are as a product of only one of these things, but because of a combination of these factors. So we're kind of like a recipe baking in the oven. There are so many different ingredients that pour into us that lead to our well-being or our lack thereof. So an example, you can see several are listed here. For the biological component, let's say a person is struggling with mental health problems. I'll say a person is having a lot of depression, for instance, major depressive disorder. So here we have the biological components like physical health, neurochemistry, genetic vulnerability. So perhaps depression runs in that person's family. Perhaps that person has a serotonin imbalance. Perhaps that person has chronic physical illness. And all of these things can contribute to this mental health concern that we're talking about. For that same person, the blue section here, psychological, it would be our behavior, some of these personality or attitude components, our learning and memory, and just our emotions and our emotional regulation, how we're feeling about ourselves. So for the person who's struggling with depression, perhaps that person is lacking coping skills. Perhaps that person is struggling with self-esteem, and obviously the emotional component or the regulation is not there if that person is dealing with such intense experiences of depression. And so all of these psychological factors, and again, we talked about the thoughts can be a big part of this as well. So this person has these genetic and biological vulnerabilities. This person is having these psychological components, maybe trauma, and that would be kind of tied into the social as well. That's why life events are here in this teal area, because traumatic events, which trauma is a really popular and high focus area of study and research in the field of psychology right now. So I encourage you to pay attention, look into it. I don't think it's going anywhere. It's a popular one, and we're learning more and more about what trauma does to the brain. So if a person has a traumatic experience, that can involve both these psychological components, the thought processes, some of the PTSD, for instance, as well as these social components, and particularly if that trauma was interpersonal, like an assault, for instance. So if the person is having these thoughts, feelings, flashbacks, emotional challenges, that can also contribute to the depression, back to that example. And then finally, the social section of the biopsychosocial approach, because what we know is not only do our relationships have a major impact on our well-being, so that could be a positive and supportive and constructive household environment growing up, or it could be quite the opposite. We know that these can affect our emotional stability and our coping skills that we have kind of in our bank that we can tap into when we're struggling. And in addition to this, things like social support with peer relationships, what kind of people are we around? So maybe this person struggling with depression is spending time with a lot of other people who are in a dark place and also struggling, or maybe isn't spending time with much of anyone. And so isolation is a part here as well. Family background, maybe this person was abandoned by a parent or did not have a consistent home environment or witnessed abuse or experienced it. And then finally, socioeconomic status. So if the person lives in a chronic state of poverty, for instance, that can definitely contribute to these feelings of hopelessness and depression. And it's not just poverty that's a factor here, but I'm just throwing it out as part of our example. So what's going on for that person with employment? Has that person been able to maintain employment and income? Is that person experiencing resource scarcity? And if so, how is that contributing to the pot or the recipe of this depressive experience? So when a person, if you work in the future as a therapist or any kind of case manager or a professional in the field of psychology, or even in the medical field as well, we're looking at the whole person and saying, how are these ingredients being sprinkled in to create this pot of struggle and difficulty? What biological factors are contributing to this mental health concern? What psychological factors are contributing, and what social factors are contributing? And on the other side of the coin, if somebody's doing well, you can look at each of these three areas as well and say which strengths and supports in each of these areas have contributed to this person's well-being. And so that is the biopsychosocial approach. And that's the last thing we'll cover today. The diathesis stress model is something that we'll get into throughout the course. But basically, this model, it's just on the side here, the left. So I'll just mention that it states that while these biological, psychological, and sociological factors can contribute to a mental health problem, a person must experience a certain level of stress to have these symptoms really exacerbated and for them to manifest. So all of these things can come together to just create this stew of trouble and dysfunction and lack of health. Okay, so we'll do a lot of examination coming up in the future. We have an examination of addiction through the biopsychosocial lens. Very, very interesting, especially if addiction is not something you've worked with a lot before. If you do have life experiences with addiction, then you can pull from those too. But either way, it's a unique perspective that not all of us have taken before on that topic. So with that said, we will conclude, but I want to hear, oh, yes, good question, Sarah. Thanks for the question. So Sarah says difference between attitudes and beliefs or behavior. Yeah. So when we're talking about the cognitive components, the thought processes, these are things that you can't look at somebody and observe them doing. But an attitude or belief could be nobody cares that I'm alive, or it could be religious belief. You know, if we're talking in the positive direction, it could be faith in God. Oh, what kind of test will we be taking? Good question. It's multiple choice. Does that help, Rain? So there's no short. Okay. Yeah, sure. So there's no short answer. So attitudes or belief could be that self-esteem component, thinking badly about ourselves, you know, negative thoughts or feelings. The behavioral component is something that is observable, something that someone can watch us do. So in the field of psychology, if we're thinking about harmful or unhealthy behavior, that could be the behavior is abusing alcohol. The behavior is anger, escalation, raising of voice. The behavior is violence. The behavior is self-harm. You know, these are topics that come up a lot in the field. Usually if people are receiving psychological help, therapy, or some other approach, it's not going to be because they're just doing so well. It's going to be because there's a behavior that has bubbled to the surface that is bringing them there. And it could be that somebody is struggling more with attitudes and beliefs than the external behavioral component, or it could be that somebody's struggling more with that external behavior and needs to analyze with a provider and a professional and tap into what attitudes and beliefs, my thought processes, are contributing to this unhealthy and destructive behavior so that we can target that and get some growth and some health established. Is that helpful, Sarah?
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. You all have really good questions and you have made this session enjoyable. So thank you for your time. Anything else before we wrap up so you can go enjoy your evening? All right. Well, thank you for your presence here. It means a lot to see all of you. Good luck with the quiz. Keep me posted if you need anything or if you want to talk about any of the questions afterwards. Okay. And enjoy the weekend. One more day. Okay. Happy Friday tomorrow to all of you. All right. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a good night.